Hi, everybody.
Hi, Elana.
How are you? Okay, so I'm supposed to say something at the beginning of this recording so that they can tell which is my share and which is somebody else. So we're going to say it right now. Good noon, because it's supposed to be either good morning or good afternoon, but good noon. And welcome to the 22nd Annual Yemei Iyun on Tanakh, Jewish Thought, and Talmud in memory of Riva Kashitsky, Zichrona Livracha. My name is Elana Stein Hain, and the topic of my shir today is when, parentheses, do the ends justify the means? Okay? Now we're recording. It's great to see everybody. I hope that you've had a great morning of learning. What I would like to do is I'd like to address the question of the relationship between ends and means, which essentially is a way of asking, are there certain goals or things you're trying to do that justify doing things on the way to getting to those goals that you shouldn't do? And conversely, are there, despite the wonderful goals that you have, that you're trying to achieve, are there certain things that you just aren't allowed to do, even to get to those wonderful goals? And I'll tell you, my interest in this topic is twofold. One is a general philosophical interest, a general ethical interest. Today happens to be the convergence of Rosh Chodesh Tammuz, the first yahrzeit of my mentor, Professor David Weiss Halivni, Zichrona Livracha, and Juneteenth, the federal holiday that commemorates the liberation of slaves in one way or another, really an emancipation proclamation in Texas. And in terms of the question of ethics, I think I'm very interested in the question of when do we let ourselves off the hook in terms of these ends and means questions. My thesis in college was on Rabbi Dr. Morris Rafal, who was the rabbi of B'nai Jeshurun in New York in the mid-19th century. And he gave a talk in 1861 on the verge South Carolina had already seceded, in 1861 on what he called the Bible view of slavery. And it is a very disturbing and depressing talk. Essentially what he does, prompted by the fact that many abolitionists were anti-Semitic, and Jews were very scared of what would happen in the event of a civil war, he essentially gives a talk promoting slavery as something that the Bible is okay with, and that we shouldn't be righteous overmuch, and what we should do instead is we should try to ameliorate the conditions of slaves, which is impossible and was impossible. And I remember reading this and I said, I understand the ends that you're trying to go for, but the means are abhorrent. I had a similar experience with my teacher, Professor David Weiss Halivni, when I was in grad school and I wanted to cut a particular corner in order to get something that I needed. And he said, no way. V'yitem nikiyim me'Hashem u'miYisrael. You have to be fully innocent. The ends do not justify the means here. So from an ethical perspective, I am interested in this question. I am also interested in this question from a halachic perspective. I think that many of us are interested in trying to get to certain goals that we hope will help the community live a more halachic life in a way that is more bearable for people and for certain people in our communities. And to that end, we often ask ourselves, what are we allowed to do to get to those ends? So I'm really looking at this from both sides. We only have an hour. All I'm going to do here is give you a basic introduction, okay? We have two parts, and I'm going to give you the makorot in a minute, the sources in a minute. We have two parts. One is, I want to give you like a spectrum, a schematic of ends. That is, what are the goals that rabbinic literature talks about where there's a possibility of maybe bending the means a little bit or doing things that you wouldn't ordinarily do? What's that spectrum? And we're going to go from like saving lives to preventing someone from doing a small sin or a big sin, right? And I want to give you a spectrum also as well as means, in the realm of means, right? So some means we're talking about like violating one of the big three cardinal sins of Judaism, right? And some means we're talking about like violating a small rabbinic injunction, right? So I want to give you a spectrum of that. That's part one, right? We already only have 50 minutes. How did that happen?
That's a little fast.
But good.
Very fast.
Part two. I want to talk about something that is near and dear to my heart, which is what happens when instead of saying, we've got these ends that are great and these means that are no good, and we're trying to figure out when we're allowed to use these to get to that, what if we change the means a little? We call that legal loopholing. What if we change the means a little? What does it feel like to have a discourse around that, changing the means a little, changing the process a little in order to get to the same end, rather than just saying, you know what, these ends justify being able to do this thing that's wrong. We try to make the thing right, the process right? So that's part two. So let's start with part one. I want to start with a question before I give you Eddie Makoro. My question is, what do you think should matter as variables in the question of whether you are allowed to do certain things that are considered violations in order to get somewhere that is considered noble and important? What are some of the variables that you might take into account in that question? Let's call them out. Oh, of course. Excuse me. You know what? You're right. I should give it to you. I just don't want you to cheat. No cheating. Okay? No cheating. Good. Okay. Call them out. I want to put them on the board. Harm. What kind of harm is the process that you're going to use going to do to other people?
Physical and spiritual.
Harm. You're saving someone from harm, or you're going to be doing harm? Okay, so harm. Great. So actually what we can do is we can put means over here and we could put ends. What do we take into account? So for the ends, how much harm are you trying to prevent, right? And for the means, how much harm are you going to have to do? They don't all have to fit in both categories. So call them out.
Save a life.
Saving a life. I'm going to keep that in harm. Great. What kind of harm are you trying to prevent? You are trying to prevent someone from death, right? That's a pretty serious harm that you're trying to prevent. Great. What else?
Communal unity or discord.
Good. So is that in means or is that in ends? Both.
Okay.
Right? Meaning, what are you trying to do in terms of the communal life, let's put it that way, and what kind of discord are you willing to allow? I don't know if I spelled discord right, I'll be honest. Tell me if there's an H or not.
No, there's no H.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
No way.
Thank you.
I was a spelling champion. Guilty.
By the way, it's good. It's always good to have one of those in the room. Okay, what else? What else? Yes?
The number and quantity of people affected.
Good, okay. Which also kind of can work in harm, but both quantity, right? Quantity affected. Did I do that right?
Yes.
Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem. Okay, quantity affected. I'm going to add a few. You ready? How about, and this is really in the means, how many times do you have to do it?
Oh.
Is this going to be ongoing, or is it going to be a one-off? Okay? By the way, it's not so dissimilar from quantity affected in the sense that it's how
Quantity of
right, but eventually it becomes the quality of Jewish life, right? Like if you're doing this all the time, you've now changed what Jewish life is. Yes, what do you got?
Just another end would be like Avodat Hashem.
Avodat Hashem, meaning what is your goal? Your goal is Avodat Hashem. We're going to see. It's going to be really interesting. Okay, let's get to the sources. We have a lot up there, and we can add more. So again, I told you in part one, what we're going to try to do is give you a spectrum. I don't need to put the sources on the sheet. We know that the most famous version of the ends justify the means in Jewish law is saving a life by breaking Shabbos. It's the one we all know. It can happen many times. Let's talk about that. The harm that you are preventing, the ends here, it is the ultimate harm that you are preventing. So we're going to give me a second, okay? We got to build it for a minute. The ultimate harm that you are preventing, someone's physical mortality, right? The means for getting there pretty high stakes means of being able to break Shabbos. I understand we're going to see in Amoraic literature all sorts of explanations why this may even be an upkeeping of Shabbos in some way, but lema'aseh, practically speaking, you are being allowed to violate a violation that is a death penalty violation, like an actual death penalty violation of violating Shabbos in order to save at least a Jewish life, right? That's a pretty intense scale. And I'd like to argue that when we look at the spectrum of possibilities, you see this general approach of when you're saving a life or lives, we're okay with you kind of going way off the rails. But then you start talking about some other things like saving Torah, saving someone from committing a sin, allowing someone to do a mitzvah. And that's where we're a little more cagey about what means you're allowed to use, okay? So I'm going to pause there. What did you want to say?
I was going to suggest, is it okay to even make the spectrum longer by saying, in the case of saving a life, or as you said, a Jewish life, it's not the ends justify the means, but the ends require the means?
Good. So, great. That is great. And in fact, I think in a way that actually kind of explains something. It kind of explains something in what we're going to look at right now. I want to give us an example on a national scale and maybe even a completely human scale of the same principle of really, really serious goal of saving people from destruction and really, really serious violation in order to do that saving, okay? I want to look at it. Take a look in Roman numeral 2, which is actually source number 1, okay? The example is in the Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud, Horio 10b, and it says as following. Amar Ula. Ula says, Tamar Zinta. You know, Tamar, in the book of Breshit, she committed a licentious act. She was supposed to marry Yehuda's third kid, and she slept with Yehuda, right? That's what she did. That's a licentious act. But you know what? Zimri Zina, and we also see in the book of Bamidbar, Zimri, as in Cosby and Zimri, who sleep together in front of everybody, also did a licentious act. And yet, Tamar Zinta, Tamar did this licentious act, Yatzu mimena melachim univiim. Tamar had her progeny ends up as the line of David, ultimately, right? That's how her progeny ends up. Zimri Zina, naflu kama revavot mi Yisrael. Zimri committed licentious act, and myriads of Jews died. So explain to me, it's the same act. This one did a violation, this one did a violation. How come this one gets to be the mother of kingship, basically, and this one ends up with a plague, right? So the Gemara continues. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, Gidola avera lishma me mitzvah shelo lishma. Performing an avera, like committing adultery, essentially. Although, by the way, it's possible that according to ancient Near Eastern law, Tamar sleeping with Yehuda was a kind of yibum.
Yeah.
Right? But that's not the way the Gemara is taking it here, right? Performing an avera lishma, for its own sake, or I would say with good intentions in some way. Performing an avera is better than doing a mitzvah for the wrong reasons. Shene'emar, how do we know this? Because in Shoftim, Tevora HaShofetet, her song includes Tevorach Minashim Yael Eshet Chever Hakeni Minashim Ba'ohel Tevorach. Yael was a married woman in Navi, slept with Sisera, seduced him in order to save the Jewish people, essentially, beat back his army so that she could kill him, right? And the way that Devorah talks about her is Tevorach Minashim. She is the most blessed among women, more blessed than other women. So what are we talking about? Man ninhu Nashim ba'ohel. Which women is she better than? Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, V'Leah. Right? Whoa.
Heavy.
What is Aveira Lishma? Anybody here ever do an Aveira Lishma?
Probably.
I hope not. I hope not. Can I tell you why? It turns out Dr. Ruth Kara Ivanov Kaniel,
Excuse me, can you explain Aveira Lishma?
literally, it means a transgression for its own sake. Now, for its own sake,
For God's sake?
great. So there are different explanations. I'm most convinced by the explanation that is doing an Aveira with a good intention. I'm actually most convinced by that because I think it makes the most sense in this situation. Because think about who Yael was, why she was doing what she was doing. She was doing it for a good intention. She was doing, right?
To kill Cicero.
To kill Sisera, to save the Jewish people, right? It's a pikuach nefesh. It's on parallel. It's on parallel. I like the facial expression because it means people are like really
I don't
thinking.
want
But
to
one second, first Frida, and then we'll get, yeah.
I'm glad you're clarifying this because when we say you do a mitzvah lishma, you're doing it for its own sake, for the sake of the mitzvah. If you might be led to think that if you say avera lishma, you're meaning I am doing this not just because I have a tithe for, I have an appetite for it. I'm
Right, like
doing this to
lahachis.
stick my foot
Like you're
in
right.
God's
That
eye.
is not what Avera
And-
Lishma
but
is.
I just want to be very clear that that's not what it means because it.
Correct. I want to make very clear, Avera Lishma is mentioned twice in the whole Babylonian Talmud. Twice. And it's literally this in Horiot and this and in Nazir. It's the same sugya. It's the same sugya. There are no other, it's not like, Avera Lishma, I'm going to eat on Yom Kippur in order to save myself. No, that's Pikuach Nefesh. That's a totally different conversation. But parallel,
That's the key
right?
for you.
The only place where you have Avera Lishma, and this is what Dr. Kaniel points out, the only place you have Avera Lishma, number 2, I will argue that in rabbinic literature, these 4 heroines, and the 4 heroines she's talking about are the heroines that show up in both Horiot and Nazir. In this version, I'm going to call on you in 1 second. We have Ruth, is going to show up later in this sugya. We're not talking about her now. The 2 daughters of Lot, and forget Yael for a second, Tamar. What do these 4 ladies have in common?
How about Esther?
Doesn't come up in this sugya. King David.
But they all
The 2 daughters of Lot make Moab. Ruth the Moabite comes from Moab. Tamar is sleeping with Yehuda. Just look at the end of Megillat Ruth. We get our whole ancestry goes back to Tamar. So she notices this. She's like, wait a second. Something's happening here. She says, I will argue that in rabbinic literature, these 4 heroines, who become the 4 mothers of the Davidic dynasty, represent a unique ethic under which they are permitted to engage in prohibited sexual acts. As scholars have argued, the birth of the Jewish Messiah derives from a concatenation, try saying that 5 times fast, of female sexual transgression, including incest, Lot's daughters, harlotry, Tamar, and seduction, Ruth. While this notion is rooted in the biblical narratives as a mythic pattern or a type scene, weaving together the tales of Ruth, Tamar, and Lot's daughters, only in the era of the Second Temple did sages situate this genealogy within the messianic concept and the idea of redemption through sin. It's so interesting. But look at what they're basically doing. They're basically saying, look, they're not asking you to go do Averot Lishma everywhere. It is very, very, very constrained and after the fact, right? How is it possible that all these women who did these terrible sexual sins actually created the Davidic dynasty? Well, it must be that what happened there was justified to save the Jewish people. To me, it's a parallel with Pikuach Nefesh in a different kind of way. Whether it's Yael's Pikuach Nefesh, which has nothing to do with the Davidic dynasty, right? Or it's Lot's daughters who were trying to save the world. Literally, thought they were saving the world, and in fact, the continuation of the Gemara before this, and I quoted the Nazir version. Why I quoted the Nazir version and not the Horeo version, I don't know. I can't explain it to you myself, but I did. Okay. And take a look at number 3. My dichtiv, what is meant in Hosea? Ki yesharim darchei Hashem. God's ways are right. V'tzadikim yelchu bam, and the righteous will be able to walk in them. Ufosh'im yikashlu bam, but those who are wicked will be stumbled by them, will stumble. what's this talking about? Mashal lelot u'shtei v'notav imo. The mashal is for Lot and his 2 daughters when they slept together. Hen shenitkavnu l'shem mitzvah. They who did this because they were trying to do a mitzvah. What's their mitzvah? Saving the world. They thought everybody was dead. Saving the world. V'tzadikim yalchubam. They're considered righteous and they're following God's way. And this is why I think it's good intention. It's about intention. Hu shenitkaven l'shem avera, but he, Lot, who was enjoying himself as incest, right? Now, we might have decided that that's what Lot was doing. He was probably not so aware, but this is the way that Chazal are saying it. Ufoshevi kashlubam. He's an exemplar of the bad people are going to be stumbled by it. So it's the same act, but this one is doing it for good, and this one's doing it for bad, and that makes all the difference. Fascinating, right? You have the same act. That also adds another variable in here. But that's the first like step along our spectrum that I want to show us is that Chazal have a communal version of pikuach nefesh that they allow for the sake of saving the community in a very physical way, right? Physical existence, they allow they have a very high tolerance for serious violation, right? But again, it's after the fact, right? So would they say before the fact? I don't know. I'm always partial when somebody who is young raises their hand because next generation, I apologize, but there is somebody who asked first because I'm also partial to people who are older than you who raise their hand because to give the proper kavod to those who are very sophisticated and know a lot more than we do. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. When you speak of the heroines, what comes into my mind is that you take into account the nature of the licentiousness. In other words, rather than commit adultery, maybe in this particular case, I was better off killing that person rather than I should become an adulteress. So are we just ignoring that?
It's great. It's great. And this goes back to the, what's your name? Bob. This goes back to Bob's point about do the ends require the means or not, right? So the question is, for Yael, for example, did she see any other way? Was there any other way to do this? For Lot's daughters, was there any other way to do this? It seems like Chazal, maybe because they're working off of a Tanakhic text that is already passed, right? It seems like Chazal are not taking them to task for, could you have done it differently, right? It seems like they're trusting them that this was the only way to go, which I think is very interesting. And prospectively, when shilas are asked of people, different shutim, different responsa that we have throughout the ages, the poskim are much, much more hesitant ahead of time to say, you can do this, right? Rather than after the fact saying, right? So pikuach nefesh is so full-throated, you should do this, you should do this. This example is after the fact, it already happened, and they come up with this idea of Avera Lishma, but they don't really want to use it anywhere else for understandable reasons, right? Great question. Yes, and I'm going to come back to you. Yes?
What would be the status of like various sins of, say, like Tamar, Lot's daughters, all those in between when the action actually happened and when like the sages like decreed that it would be okay? Like for example, in like Moshe Rabbeinu's time, what would Moshe Rabbeinu say about what Tamar did?
Okay, so I think that's a great question, which is why I mentioned that in ancient Near East, what Tamar did might have been yibum, right? Like getting her father-in-law to sleep with her might have been a totally legitimate way of keeping the family name alive, right? So what I'm looking at is I'm wondering how Chazal shaped this conversation, right? How this conversation would have looked in some other, what we do know is Yehuda says, Hotziu v'tisaref, send her out, let her be killed, thinking that she slept with someone else. And then when he realizes, she says, tzad kamimeni. So when he says tzad kamimeni, is he saying what she did was okay, or what I did was bad, and I put her in this position? Question mark, great question, right? Great question, don't know. What do we have?
So if you take what you said over there, that Chachamim won't decree it in advance, you're making the people to a certain extent.
I think that's a great point. The question of precedent rather than psak, and then what happens after the fact. And in some ways, history is written by the victors, right? Yeah. Let's say with Yael and Sisera, let's say it hadn't worked.
But
let's say it hadn't worked.
I wasn't focusing
Right.
on the victor, I was focusing more.
But what I'm saying is,
in the end,
if it
the
goes
people
well, what I'm saying is, if it goes well and it actually does save the Jewish people, then you look back and you say, this was the right move. But when you're making that move, are there other options that you can do? Are we sure this is actually going to work? Right? Like the retrospective versus the prospective. Boop. Question mark. Right? I told you, I'm not going to solve anything for you. I'm going to open it because I think people should spend a lot more time thinking about this issue.
Yes.
Just and adding to that, are you the one to do it?
Oh my gosh. Yes.
That's what I was asking.
Yes.
Oh, very good.
Please. And then we're going to go on because I want to keep going on this spectrum to not less important, but less urgent just right now. In this second, just do this thing once and everything will be saved. Right? Also notice, it's a one-time. I don't expect to be doing Pikuach Nefesh every week on Shabbos. I don't expect to be sleeping with random generals every week to save people. I'm serious, right? Like, it's a one-time urgent situation. We're not changing halacha. They're calling it an aveira. It's an aveira. But it's lishma. We're going to do it now, right?
If you work for Hatzalah, though, you might be doing it every Shabbos.
So actually, I think that's where we start asking ourselves, maybe we're talking about making a change rather than just an exigency, emergency, right?
Yeah.
Another question mark. Yes, please.
And I understand how Yael's daughters and Tamar had no other option, it seems. But what were it seems like roots of tensions, but
Great.
What was she trying to achieve?
Great. So, question. What I will say is if you look at the sugya, whether in Horiot or in Nazir, what you will see is the Gemara doesn't really talk about Ruth's decision to try to, go into Boaz's room at night, whatever that looks like in this context. What they actually talk about is, even doing a mitzvah shalom lishma is actually a good thing because look at in the zechut that Bilam gave 42 korbanot, shalom lishma, in order to get God to allow Bilam to curse the Jewish people. Root came from him. So they're not talking as much about her sexual engagement. They're talking a little bit more about even where she comes from. So I'm not sure. And I think it's interesting that they're not bringing in her, going to Boaz's room at night, right? Did they think that's just, she's trying to get him to be the Goel. She's trying to get him to be the Redeemer. And she didn't do anything. She just sat there, right? Or was there more to it? Which the Gemara talks about. Maybe there was more to it, right? In different places, right? So I'm leaving it there, okay? I'm punting. That's what we call it, punting, okay? Let's keep going on the spectrum. How about this? How about saving Torah? Now, we know about the concept, we can't get every concept in here. Many of us know about the concept of Hora'at Sha'ah, like giving a momentary, emergency ruling, not just the people do it and then we decide, but a ruling, and often a Hora'at Sha'ah is for the purpose of saving Torah, right? The example of Hora'at Sha'ah, the example par excellence of Hora'at Sha'ah is Eliyahu at Hara Carmel being allowed to offer a sacrifice outside of the precincts of the temple in order to show that God is God and not the paganism of the fake Nevi'im who were trying to say that pagan gods are God, right? So he was allowed, that's an emergency measure. That happens once, a total of one time. But more interesting to me is 4. The Gemara in Brachot reads this beautiful pasuk in Tehillim Kuf Yud Tet, which is all about extolling the beauty of Torah. It has 8 psukim in each letter of the alphabet, extolling the beauty of Torah. And within it, Ve'omer, okay, says 8, La'asot La'Hashem Efever Toratecha. Sounds like it's saying, it's time to do something for Hashem because, Lahafer,
Someone else's.
yeah, nullified, destroyed. Because it's time to do for Hashem because they have destroyed your Torah, right? In a parak in Tehillim that's all about the beauty of Torah, it sounds like we're trying to defend Torah from people who would get rid of it, right? So, Amar Rava says, Hi Kra, this pasuk, Me'reishei l'seifei midarish. You could read it from beginning to end. But also, Miseifei l'reishei midarish. You could also read it from end to beginning. Mireishei l'seifei midarish. We can read it from beginning to end. Eight lasot laHashem. It is time to do for God. My tam. Why? Mishum hefer Toratecha. Because these other people are doing the wrong thing, right? Like it's time to stand up for God because those other people have nullified your Torah. Great. So we're going to be stricter. We're going to hold the line. We're going to, right? But he says, Miseife l'reishe midarash. You can also read it from end to beginning. Heferu Toratecha. They have nullified your Torah. My timer. Why? Mishum eight lasot laHashem. For the purpose of God. They have nullified your Torah for the purpose of God. What? Chazal use this to explain why it was okay to write down Torah Sheba'al Peh, oral Torah, even though you're not supposed to write down Torah Sheba'al Peh. They use this as, this is how it's used. It's not used to say you can do this and you can do that. It is used to say we are making a fundamental paradigm shift, not one time, fundamental paradigm shift. In order to save Torah, we have to do things differently. Even though we have a ruling that you're not allowed to write down oral law, we are going to allow it in order to save Torah. Okay? Now, in terms of what we're talking about here, how serious are the ends that you're trying to get to? The harm that you're trying to prevent? Pretty serious, right? Pretty serious. You don't want, people are going to forget Torah, they're going to forget all of oral law. We can't do that. But my question is like, how severe are the means that you're using? Like, how severe is the violation of writing down Torah in order to keep it when you're not supposed to write it down? What do you think?
I actually think it's pretty serious.
What?
And I'm saying it's serious not only because of what you're doing at the moment, but the implications for the future.
Right. So I think this is a really interesting, pivotal point on the spectrum. Because on the spectrum of like, what are you trying to do and how are you allowed to do it? Because you're not saving a life, but you are saving Torah. That's pretty big, right?
But what Torah are you saving and what was the intent of Torah? All of that.
Right. But the process by which you're doing it may have really, really big implications for Torah. The Torah that you're saving, right? Right? And it goes back again, Bob. Do the ends require the means? And then how do you deal with the fallout of those means? Right? And there is fallout. There's definitely fallout. There's no question that there's fallout. I can't name all the different things, how it changed Torah and the way we think about Torah and accessibility and blah, blah, blah. But like, it definitely changed things. And I'm more interested in this than Horat Shah, because Horat Shah is like, okay, one time. This is like, whoa, paradigm shift. Okay? I want to give him a chance because he hasn't spoken up yet. Yes. Or maybe you did speak up for like a second. So then I'll give you both a chance. Go.
So
It's the problem when I know people.
look at the consequences of the fact that the Talmud has been used by anti-Semites over the years to quote in and out of context all sorts of things that they say justify its burning.
The burning of the Talmud in Paris in 1242.
Right.
Wouldn't have happened if it wasn't written down.
Right.
Wouldn't have happened. There's no access. Right? So does it save Torah or didn't Paris Torah?
But we
How
weren't
could they?
talking about it in 2023 if it wasn't written down.
Right. That's the. Part of what I'm trying to show here is that there's some logic to the way that Chazal talk about this, but it's also really a network of different conversations. There is no one answer to did the ends justify the means. There just is no one answer in Chazal. We're going to be weighing a lot of things, but I'm trying to make a little order out of it because I think it gives us a sense that there's some coherence, because there is some coherence. It's not fully consistent always, but there is some coherence, which I think is interesting. Right? Yeah.
No, I'm just going to, the example you brought up, when you say, Pikuach Nefesh is an immediate one-time thing right in front of you, concrete, writing shows. The question about writing it down and reading the scrolls, that is so much of a broader, long-term kind of thing that it's much harder to make a decision because you don't really know exactly or even very much. I mean, obviously, if they made that decision, things were pretty bad and they knew they had to do something.
Right.
But
could you argue that both of these examples, Aver Lishma, which is a one-time exigent, save the community or even save humanity, and write down Torah, that's oral, but that's not a one-time, it's ongoing and it makes it...
Ongoing,
Can you argue that both of them in some way are nourished by the idea of pikuach nefesh, right?
Yeah.
Both of them are
Oh,
nourished.
sure.
Not just because pikuach nefesh saving, but even the fact that it could happen every week. And even if it happens every week, you're not going to be in a war. I mean, God willing, you're not going to be in a war. But maybe in the era of the state of Israel, maybe we also see something a little bit different that's happening.
Yeah.
But the idea of pikuach nefesh by changing the rules on Shabbos, that could happen all the time. In theory, we hope it doesn't, but it could. So. Great. So we have a little bit of a treat.
Well,
Can I do one more thing?
Sure.
Yeah.
You know,
No, go
are you
ahead.
sure? Oh, you're so good. I appreciate you so much. Okay. Meaning I want to hear what you have to say, but I want to get there.
It's
Okay.
getting later and later.
I want to give. It is getting later and later. We're getting older and older. So I want to keep going on the spectrum, and we could keep going. I'm not even giving you the whole spectrum. Okay. I want to keep going on the spectrum. Saving a person from sin or punishment. Interesting. A little different. By the way, shilas were asked in the Middle Ages. People who were converting to Christianity, maybe being forcibly converted, can you go on Shabbos, violate Shabbos to go get them, bring them back, right? Like,
Yeah.
but here's an individual case. Something you need to know. On Shabbos, we don't have these ovens anymore. Maybe people who have worked in pizza ovens know more about this kind of thing. But the way that their ovens used to work, they would put in the bread and stick it to the wall of the oven. It is a rabbinic violation to peel that off
On
Shabbos, okay? Because they call it's like chokhmah. It's not melacha. It's not a biblical violation. It's chokhmah. It's a certain way of doing things in like a professionalized manner. Not allowed to do it rabbinically, though. Okay? You tell me. Here's the story. What's your name? Nope, behind you. Yeah. Yonah. By the way, is it annoying when people call you Yonah? No, I'm not going to. My husband's name is Yonah. We call him Yonah Ben. And then the Yonahs that we know that are women, we call them Yonah Bat. So Yonah Bat, okay? Let's say, God forbid, accidentally, you put bread in the oven on Shabbos. And you put it on the side. God forbid, okay? And then you're like, oh, shoot, I got to take that out before it cooks and I violate Shabbos, right? Because you haven't violated Shabbos until it actually cooks. Right? Or bakes, excuse me. So let's see what happens. Here's your story. Number 6. What'd you say? It's the train dilemma. Right? Say more about the train dilemma.
Oh.
When you have to do an active thing, you can pull the lever and that would divert the train that would otherwise kill 5 people and would kill 1 person instead.
Yes, the trolley problem it's called.
Trolley.
No, that was a great recall. The trolley is headed for 5 people to kill them if they keep it on the tracks. You can change it, but it's going to kill 1 person. Are you allowed to actively do that? Or better to passively let it go? Here we go. Trolley problem. Bai Rav Bibi Bar Abaye. Rav Bibi Bar Abaye asked the following. Hidbik pat b'tanur. If somebody stuck the bread in the oven, hitiru lo lirdota kodem sheyavo lidei chiyuv chatat? Do the rabbis allow this person to take it out, to peel it off, even though that's a rabbinic violation, before they come to violate a sin that they have to give a korban for? Olo hitiru, or do they not allow it? Right, so we're trying to save you from sin. We're not saving your life. We're trying to save you from a pretty big sin of violating Shabbos. Right? Yonah was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that. Right? Like, we want to. Amar le Rav Acha bar Abaye le Ravina. So Rav Acha bar Abaye says, wait, hey chidami, we'll explain the case. Ilema b'shogeg, if this person did this by accident, meaning they didn't realize it was Shabbos, or they didn't realize this is Usher on Shabbos, then, like, velo idkarle, they don't remember yet. So Laman Hitiru, who are you allowing? Like, Yonah doesn't know she did anything wrong. She's not going to want to take the bread out. What's the case exactly? Ve'elalav di'ihadar ve'idkar, but what if Yonah remembers? She's like, oh, shoot, no, it's Shabbos. I totally forgot that it's Shabbos. Or I thought we were still in the 18 minutes, but actually we're past the 18 minutes. I didn't realize that it was Shabbos yet. And now I realize, right? But if that's the case, that she remembers in the middle before it got baked, mi mechayiv, does she really have to bring a korban? V'hatnan, don't we have a Mishnah that says, kol chayavei chatot, any requirement to give a korban, meaning any violation that you do that requires a korban, einan chayavin asher tehei tchilatan shkaga v'sofan shkaga. You're only required to give a korban if the entire process was accidental. The minute you realize it, you no longer have to give a korban. You only give a korban if you did something b'shogeg, accidental all the way. So this is not possible that this was an accidental situation because it says, do they allow her to take it out before she does a violation that will require her to give a korban? There is no violation that requires her to give a korban if she remembers that you did something wrong because only the beginning of the process was by accident and not the end, and you can't give a korban for that. Okay? Ella b'mezid. Actually, what we're talking about is Yonah has a rebellious streak. She did it on purpose. Sorry, Yonah. Okay? But then the Gemara says, no, then it shouldn't be talking about giving a korban. You don't give a korban if you do things on purpose to violate Shabbos. You get skila, you get stoning, right? Kodem sheyavo lidei iser skila mi violate. It should have said, do we allow her to take it out before she comes to violate a transgression that's going to require her to get stoned? Amar Rav Shila, so Rav Shila says, okay, so we got to fix this. We got to figure out what the situation is. Le'olam b'shogeg. We're talking about she did it by accident. She didn't know it was Shabbos, or she didn't know it was Asr, and she still doesn't know. Okay? Ulamani tiru, who are they talking about allowing? Achirim, other people. I come into the kitchen, I see that Yonah has put this in. I said, oh my gosh, she probably didn't even realize she put it in on Shabbos. She didn't realize I already lit candles. She didn't realize. Am I allowed to take it out? Am I allowed to violate? Who said, and are you going to be the one to do it? Are you going to be the one to do it? Am I allowed to violate? To take it out for her. To save her. To help her from committing this violation. What do you think? Let's take a vote. Who thinks I should be able to take it out? Who thinks I should not? Give me the I should not. Tell us why.
Because you're now committing a transgression which you otherwise wouldn't have committed at all.
Right, like why am I getting myself in here? Right? What about the people who say, I should be able to take it out? Give us some logic.
Well, what if you thought maybe erroneously that it would cause a fire?
Okay, let's assume here, Chazal, this is the beauty of the way that Chazal do things. They
Narrow it down.
what's the word? No, but it's also, they something the variables.
Compartmentalize.
Narrow, but that's not the word I'm looking for. But they put the constraints in so that you don't have distraction. But it's a great question.
All
Yeah.
Yisrael are ravens and doesn't.
Oh, but I have to, right? I'm responsible for somebody else. I can't let them violate this thing. Yeah?
It's also rabbinic versus a Torah.
It's only rabbinic. It's only rabbinic, right?
Well, no,
You know what's
that's
only
not-
rabbinic also? Not eating milk and fowl.
Yeah.
We keep that pretty seriously, but it's like, it's only rabbinic, and this person's going to violate a biblical. Great.
But what is the consequence of a rabbinic prohibition versus
Beautiful.
Torah? Right, so she's going to get killed and you're going to.
Well, in what?
Right, well, depending, right? Great. So, mat kifla Rav Sheshet argues against this. V'chi omrim lo la'adam chata kidei sheyiskeh chavercha. Do you tell somebody to sin in order to help their friend? In order so that their friend will be innocent? No way. We're not allowing it. We're not allowing it. Ella Amar Ravashi. Ravashi says, L'lam b'mezid. This is talking about Yonah had a rebellious streak. She did it on purpose. Ve'ema, and pretend it says, Kodem she'yavo lidei iser skila. Do we allow her to take it out before she comes to do this very serious violation? And you could say you're kind of saving her life, but it's not clear, right? Is it you're saving her from sin or you're saving her from punishment? Maybe a little both, right? Rav Acha Brei de Rava, so Rav Acha, son of Rava, Matni Lavahedya, learns it in the following explicit way. Amar of Bibi Bar Abaye, instead of Bibi Bar Abaye asking the question, Rav Bibi Bar Abaye says, he'd big pat betanur, if somebody puts bread into the oven, he tirulo lirdota, they allow, Chazal allow the person to peel it out. Kodem she'avo lidei iser skila. Before they come, before they come to sin on the level of something that would require them to be stoned. So this was not an accident. It was on purpose, and now she's having misgivings, right? By the way, on your own time, in number 7, there's a great sugya that asks a similar question, where you have an am haaretz, somebody who's known not to tithe, and a chaver, somebody who's known to be very careful about their tithing. In certain business interactions, should the chaver be willing to violate some of their own, like some things, in order to ensure that the am haaretz will not eat untithed food? I'm saying it's this conversation of, are you responsible for them? Are you responsible for yourself? Right? And it's a machlokes, it's an argument. So I think this adds another nice piece, both in terms of we're keeping people from sin, maybe we're keeping people from punishment. It's maybe a one-time thing, but maybe we're talking about what other people can do for you. the means are not, it's not equal of like a biblical breakage and a biblical breakage. It's the ends are to keep someone from a biblical breakage and the means are to use something rabbinic, right? Like, now we're talking, because it's not just at the edges. It's right in the uncomfortable spots, right? So I'm going to pause there, yes? And then I want to do a few things before we finish. Sorry.
There's no obligation to do it. It's you're asking the question, can I? So that your impulse is that you want to.
Great. Right? Two ends of the spectrum. Does it require? Can I? Great. Yes.
I think this goes to what you were saying about Chazal kind of narrowing the possibilities, but it still bothers me because when you apply that to human interaction, you don't know everything. When someone comes upon an oven, I don't know everything. I don't know who that's for. I don't know if they need to eat that on Shabbos and the Rav said okay. Like, should I be inserting myself here?
These are great questions.
I don't know what I don't know.
It's a perfect segue to this. Dr. Nachum Rackover, no, I'm serious. Dr. Nachum Rackover wrote a great book called Matara HaMekadeshet et HaEmtzaim, the ends, the goal, that justifies the means. It's in Hebrew. It's fantastic. He wrote a 15-page summary of it in English. All available online, Hebrew and the English. And I love this piece of his summary. Does somebody want to read it in number 8? Because he just gives us like a quick, we'll do half and half. You do the first paragraph, you do the second paragraph. Sorry about that. You'll do the 7th paragraph. I don't know yet.
Any decision to permit a violation of the law in order to preserve it must certainly evaluate, among other factors, A, the personality of the individual who would commit the violation.
By the way, we didn't even get to that, but that comes up in the She'elot Utshuvot later. Yeah?
B, the probable impact upon the community, whether permission to transgress could possibly lead to greater negligence in observance of the Torah.
Right? Another variable.
And C,
public policy.
the relative weight of the commandment to be violated compared to the violation to be prevented.
Right, so that we've seen. C, we've seen more. A and B come up more in the halachic literature post-Gemara, okay, when people are asking she'elot about these things. Let's keep going. Let's pick up next paragraph.
A survey of the sources shows that authorities have exercised extreme caution in permitting one violation in order to prevent another. And this approach has been well formulated in a response of Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda of Berlin, the Netziv of Volozhin, 18th century, or the response of the Nishiv Davar. His response reminds us of the Rambam's analogy to the practice of medicine. Quote, the principle of permitting violation of one prohibition in order to prevent violation of another must be applied with great moderation. It is similar to the practice of medicine where, if the physician sees that a person's hand pains him greatly, in some cases he'll decide to amputate the hand to prevent the pain from spreading throughout the rest of the body and endangering the patient's life. Whereas in other cases he will decide that it is preferable to suffer the pain and not lose the hand. Such a decision can be taken only after careful consideration and consultation of several doctors together, since both possibilities are fraught with...
By the way, the end of that sentence, since both possibilities are fraught with danger, my favorite part of the whole thing.
Yeah.
Right? Because it really gets to the nub of the problem. Reasonable people are going to disagree. Yeah? Okay.
The healing of the unhealthy soul must also be conducted in this manner, with much consideration and with consultation of Torah authorities, for God will help them to prevent damage.
Right? I think it's a great summary that Rackover tries to give us. Go read the book. I'm not even joking. Go read the book. It's fascinating and it's wonderful. We need to think a lot more about this topic, in my opinion. I want to do part 2 in the 12 minutes that we have left. Part 1 was giving us a nice schematic, right? Starting to really pull out the issues, give us the network of what's going on. Part 2 is, there's an approach that is similar to this, but quite different, which is the approach of loopholing. What if instead of saying you're allowed to violate X, you make it so that the means are not technically a violation? But we all know it's because you're trying to get to certain ends, right? That is a whole conversation in and of itself within Chazal. And I want to look at one example and maybe mention another, okay? I love this example. One of the things that I started doing a few years ago is I realized I can't do Daf Yomi it's too disciplined. I can't do it. But I did realize that if the whole world, the oilam, is learning ketubot for however many months, I can learn a few prakim in ketubot. And like, still be in the... So I did that with ketubot, and I came across this halachic narrative, and I was like, whoa, this is amazing. This is what you have to keep in mind. The Torah says, Isha zona v'chalala lo yikachu, v'isha grusha me'isha lo yikachu, ki kodesh hu le'elo kav. That a Kohen is not allowed to marry certain people who have had certain sexual experiences. It's just the way of it, right? Same way they can't be blemished. It's the way of it, okay? Within that, it means that if a woman was even raped by a non-Jew, she can't marry a Kohen. Kohen can't marry her, okay? That's the backdrop of this story. Number 9, the Mishnah in Ketubot. Ha'isha she'amra, eshet ishayiti urushani, a woman who says, I was married, but I'm divorced, right? She doesn't have a get to show for it, but she's like, I was married, I admit I was married. Ne'emenet, we believe her. She'apes she'asar hu apes she'hitter, because the same mouth that she used to say, I was married, which basically means no one's allowed to marry her right now. It's the same mouth that says, but I am divorced, right? So the fact that she was willing to admit that she was married, even though we have no eidin that she was married, the fact that she's willing to admit that makes us say, we believe you, okay? V'im yesh eidim shayta esha ish, but if there were witnesses that she was married before, then v'hi omer grushani, and she says, without being able to produce a get, she says, but I'm divorced. Inana emenet, we can't go just on her. We need witnesses, or we need a get. We need something, right? We can't just go on the person who's looking to get remarried, right? Amra nishbeti, second case. If a woman says, I was kidnapped. I was basically taken as a shvuya. I was taken as a prisoner. And this is assuming by non-Jewish authorities and communities. Utahorani, but I never slept with anybody. And nobody slept with me. Meaning I could still marry a Kohen if I want to marry a Kohen. Okay? Ne'emenet, we believe her. She didn't have to tell us that she was kidnapped in the first place. She'apesha asar, the mouth that told us that she's prohibited from marrying a Kohen because she said I would. She admitted of her own free will, I was taken captive, is the same mouth that says, no, but nobody slept with me. I didn't sleep with anybody, okay? But ve'im yesh edim shenishbeit, but if there are witnesses that she was taken captive, then no good. V'hi omeret Harani, and she said I was never raped. What are we going to do? In an minute, we can't. It's not sufficient evidence. It's not sufficient evidence. V'im mishaniseit bo edim, if, by the way, she got married, in either of these cases, she got married and edim came, harezo lo tetzeh, she's allowed to stay married. That's a little, right. But here's the story. Come with me to page 5. Okay? So, if there are edim, if they know from somewhere else that someone was, God forbid, taken as a captive, then her saying, that woman who was taken as a captive saying, nobody slept with me, that's not enough evidence. It doesn't meet the threshold of evidence to say you can marry a Kohen, right? But here's when real life comes to connect to the halachic rulings that seem very rigid. And loopholes come into the picture. Second paragraph on page 5. Hani shvuyata da'atyan la naharda. There were captive women, meaning Jewish women who had been taken captive by non-Jewish authorities, and they came to Naharda, meaning Shmuel's place, right? That's Shmuel's in charge of Naharda. Otiv avuha de Shmuel netori bahadayu. Shmuel's father put guards at their door to make sure no one would go near them, to make sure they didn't sleep with anyone, to make sure they'd be good for Kohanim. Meaning he's assuming they didn't sleep with anybody. Or I should say no one raped them. Amar le Shmuel, so Shmuel, his son, says to him, Va'adha idna man natrinho? Who's been guarding them up till now? Meaning, you're guarding them so that no one will sleep with them so that they can marry Kohanim? They were just shvuyot, they were just captives, of course they were raped. What are you even talking about? And you know what his father says? Amar le? He says, Ilu benatach havyon, if they were your daughters, mi habet mizalzel behu kulehai. Would you talk in such a disgusting manner about them? Whoa, strong, right? And look at this. Havai, it was like kishgaga sheyotze milifnei hashalit. it was like an error that comes forth before the ruler, meaning saying those words, if it was your daughters, made it come to pass. The Ishtavion benate demar Shmuel. Shmuel's daughters were taken captive. The Askinu la'arad Israel, and they came back to Israel with their captors. Meaning the captors probably wanted money to take, whatever it was. They came back with them. So what are we going to do right now? The captors come with the captive women. Everybody knows they were captives. The captors are right there. What's the recourse? If they don't have Eidim that say, nobody slept with us, nobody raped us, they're not going to be allowed to marry Kohanim. But these are Shmuel's daughters. She's not going to let that happen to his daughters.
No.
Right? So look at this.
Like half its
Okman l'shavoyini me'avrai. They kept the captors outside the courtroom so that the judges didn't know that these women were captives because they never saw the captors. Everybody in town knows that they were captured, but the judges don't know. Va'ayle inhi lebei medrasha de Rabbi Chanina, and these young women come into the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Chanina. Ha Amra, this one said, Nishbeti Torani, I was taken captive, but no one raped me. Vaha Amra, and this one said, Nishbeti Torani, I was taken captive, but I wasn't raped. And Sharenu, he allowed them to marry Kohan. More than that, this is the best. Sof ol atu shavoyinhu, the captors then entered the courtroom. Amar Rabbi Chanina says, ooh, benan de moryaninun, these young women, we would say today, these young women are Talmidot Chachamot, or Talmidot of Chachamim. Here it's, these young women must be the daughters of very Yiddish cups, right? And then Igloy Milta Divnate Demar Shmuel Havya. And then it was revealed that they were Shmuel's daughters. And here's the best. Amar le Rabbi Chanina, who had made the psak, he says to Rav Shimon bar Abba, who was a Kohen, Pok itapa b'krivatayich. You should marry one of these women. They're your family members. They're your cousins. You should marry one of these women. And he's like, I should? But what? But there are probably Eidim somewhere who know. Since the Eidim are not here, what's the problem? What's the problem? Right? I love this. First of all, I love all loopholes. Literally, I love all. I don't love all loopholes, actually.
Thank you.
I don't love all loopholes. I don't like loopholes that are used to exploit Torah because I don't think that that's what Chazal like loopholes. I like loopholes that find ends that are really important and say, we're not in a position to just say, you can violate whatever means you want. That's not what, we don't want to do it. We can't do it, right? Sometimes the answer is no. But are there ways to change the means enough in order to get to those same ends? This is an example. They're not saying we don't care about the fact that if there are witnesses, we don't believe these people. It's, we are creating a situation in which they are the ones who are providing the court with the information that they were captured and that they're Tohorot. That's what we're doing. What do we got? I see hands. Good, hands. Let's start with you and then we'll go to you. Sorry that I'm you-ing.
I'm a retired lawyer who never practiced law. Never litigated, but I don't think this would stand up in a court of law as evidence. You cross-examine her and say,
of course.
Are there not captors outside?
Of course. We have questions like, what actually happened in this courtroom?
So that boils down to form over substance for me. And is that really okay?
So that's a great question,
and
right?
These lucky girls, here comes the equity question. Well, they happen to be Rav Shmuel's daughter. Somebody else wouldn't have such a good lawyer.
Okay, so these are great questions. When you're talking about loopholes, and don't worry, I'm going to end in a minute. When you're talking about loopholes, you have a whole new set of questions, right? Form over substance is a big question, right? Mm-hmm. Are there times when the form is so laughable that it's really making a mockery and it's no good, right? Mm-hmm. The question of who's allowed to use the loophole and when and why. I want to point out that Shmuel's father was using that loophole way before Shmuel did, right? Meaning not for his daughters and not for his granddaughters, which I think is an interesting thing. But yes, it opens more questions, for sure. Yes, and then I got to end.
So my question really is there an assumption that they're telling the truth? Or is there an assumption that they're not telling the truth?
I think there's an assumption that they're telling the truth.
That they are.
Meaning, it goes something like this. Are you assuming that they were not raped if they say they were not raped? but it just doesn't meet the threshold for evidence in the court of law, so we need to get it to meet the threshold.
We're assuming that their
Yes,
testimony.
meaning I think they're assuming that their testimony is true.
Because
Meaning,
they put themselves at risk.
right, and meaning the Gemara itself actually talks about what would happen if Edom came and said, we are Edom, not that they were captured, but that they were raped, right? That might
Why
be
did
a
you
different,
stop at this
right, that might be a different conversation, right?
That was really
I'm saying,
correct.
like, yes, so that sugya actually continues with that conversation. What if Edom later come and say, no, they were raped, not we know that they were captive. Because if we know that they were captive, if they married, or even if they were given a heter to marry, we don't make them leave. But if two Edom come and say, no, that's evidence in a court of law, right? That's evidence in a court of law. That likely trumps. Now, I don't know la halacha, because I'm much more of a Talmudic philosopher than I am halachist. That's just my interest, because I'm not a practical person in general, in case you couldn't tell from this conversation, right? But I don't know la halacha, like what a Beit Din would do exactly. I just don't know, and I don't want to pretend that I do. Okay, I want to end with this. I'm not saying that this whole thing was a plug for the book that I wrote called Circumventing the Law, which is all about legal loopholes, but I didn't realize, it's coming out, God willing, January 2024.
Oh,
But what had happened is, basically, I finished writing the book, the publishers have it, and it's all about legal loopholes. It's all about examples like these, but specifically what Chazal call ha'arama, which is like being cunning, but also being prudent, right? I didn't realize, for some reason, I was like, what's my next project? What's my next project? Because I've been doing it for 20 years, working on loopholes. And I was like, what's the next project? And I was like, oh, mitzvah b'avi avera, doing a mitzvah at the cost of doing averot. And I couldn't figure out why I was so interested in that. And I think actually preparing this year helped me understand it. Because in some ways, these are very parallel situations where we're saying, can you violate certain things in order to do the right end? And loopholes are saying, you don't need to violate in order to get to that end. We can figure out a way to massage it. We can figure out a way so that it's not a violation. And I think that if you look at it as, like, the other option to loopholing would be to violate outright, you would say loopholing is great.
The last shiur of this year's Yemei
Last
Iyun.
sentence.
Thank you everyone for participating
sentence.
again. Downstairs, there's the leftover, some leftover food from yesterday's lunch if you'd like to take, as well as anybody who's working in the building. Also, we will daven Mincha Gedola at 1:32 in the Beit Midrash. Everyone is invited.
Last sentence. If you're thinking about legal loopholes as the alternative would be to actually break the law in order to get to the end that you want, loopholes look very good by comparison. If you're looking at it as you're not allowed to do anything, then loopholes look very manipulative by comparison. And I want to put loopholes in conversation with this other option of Avera Lishma that we really seek to constrain because of all the bad things that it can create, and ask ourselves, what are the alternatives to trying to get to those same ends? Thanks, everybody. Great learning with you. Have a great day.